The difference between research and reality, behavior symptom analysis. Almost without exception, research studies that attempt to determine whether or not an investigator can accurately evaluate a subject's credibility based on their verbal and nonverbal behaviors yield results that are typically no better than chance, 50-50, like flipping a coin. But yet, when conducting actual real-life investigative interviews, many investigators can be highly accurate in evaluating a subject's credibility. So, what gives? Why the difference? Well, when you take a look at some of the research studies, overwhelmingly the majority of them are significantly flawed in their design. For example, in many of the studies using students as subjects, they're assigned different roles. You're going to be guilty of stealing money from the professor's drawer. You're going to be innocent. Then a number of the students were instructed to lie about their status when they were subsequently interviewed by one of the research staff about their possible involvement in the theft. After all the interviews completed and reaching their conclusions as to who was deceptive and who was truthful, the evaluators were generally no better than chance at determining the subject's status. Another problem in a number of research studies is that, contrary to a real-life investigative interview, there was no opportunity to ask the subject follow-up questions after they told the investigator their original story. For example, in one study, you've got different inmates on screen talking about two different crimes they committed, one of which they really did commit, one of which they're lying about. They did not commit. And you, the reviewer, are supposed to determine, based on their presentations, which is the true crime that they committed and which is the false one, the one that they're lying about. The evaluators were generally no better than chance at determining which was the crime the inmate actually committed. See, in a real-life investigation, after the subject tells the investigator their story, we would ask a series of follow-up questions to develop additional details, to probe for additional explanations. And during this discussion, oftentimes the subject's deception would be very apparent. But they didn't have that opportunity in the research program to ask those follow-up questions. There are some additional problems with the overwhelming number of such studies. Number one, the subjects, whether they be students or prisoners or others, had low levels of motivation to be believed or to avoid detection because there was no real consequence they were going to pay if they failed in their effort. Nothing was going to happen to them, so to speak. Secondly, the interviewers of the subjects were not conducted by investigators trained in investigative interviewing techniques. There were very few, if any, follow-up questions to probe for additional details during the interviews. The studies did not employ the type of structured interview process that is commonly utilized by investigators in the field. Number four, the research studies did not follow the established protocol for the evaluation of the subject's behaviors. First of all, in most studies, there was no attempt to establish a behavioral baseline for each subject, so as to then be able to identify changes from that normal behavioral pattern as they answered investigative questions. The following example illustrates the importance of establishing a subject's normal verbal and nonverbal behavioral patterns before conducting the interview. In this case, the subject is not listening to the investigator, is constantly fidgeting during the interview, tapping his hands on the table, squirming in the chair, has poor eye contact, is excessively talking, and blurts out answers before the questions are even completed. So, on the one hand, we might conclude, boy, man, this guy is wound up tight as a drum. This is probably the guy who committed the issue. Maybe. But these can also be behaviors exhibited by individuals with ADHD. So if we don't have their normal and know what they're normally like, we're apt to make a lot of mistakes. And that's why, in so many instances, the research studies are flawed. They didn't establish the subject's normal behavioral pattern. They just showed them on screen answering questions, telling about a crime they committed, etc. The research was based on the faulty premise in most of these studies that there are specific behavior symptoms unique to truth or deception. There are no behaviors unique to truthfulness or deception. In addition, in these research studies, there was no consideration given to the various factors that can affect a person's behavioral responses, such as age, maturity, cultural influences, mental capacity, emotional and psychological level of stability, and the subject's physical condition at the time of the interview, drugs, alcohol, medical issues, etc. Furthermore, in most research studies, the interview is evaluated in a vacuum, whereas in the real world, the investigative interview of a subject takes place in the context of an investigation. For example, by the time the investigator interviews a given suspect, they may have already developed information about their relationship with the victim, their whereabouts at the time of the crime, their financial circumstance, and other relevant background information. In the Reid technique, we teach that there are several rules that all investigators should follow in the evaluation of a subject's verbal and nonverbal behaviors. Establish the subject's normal behavioral pattern, baseline behaviors, and then look for changes from that norm or baseline through the interview process. Read all behavioral processes in terms of the three channels of communication: verbal, paralinguistic, and nonverbal. Read behavioral clusters, the overall behavioral pattern, not just one thing they do or say. Consider timing and consistency for all nonverbal responses. Always evaluate the potential impact of possible factors on the subject's behavior, such as their mental capacity, psychological stability, maturity, culture, and physical well-being at the time of the interview. Always evaluate a subject's behavior symptoms in conjunction with your case facts and evidence. If these rules are followed, a subject's verbal and nonverbal behaviors can be very helpful in the assessment of the subject's credibility. Almost without exception, these assessment rules were not followed in any of the research studies conducted by social psychologists/researchers in an effort to evaluate the value of verbal and nonverbal behavior symptoms. That's why the studies are so flawed in many respects. Special note that we have: the most important element in evaluating a suspect's potential culpability in committing a crime or an act of wrongdoing is not their behavioral responses, but the content of their statement as compared to the case, facts, and evidence. The essential element to evaluate during an investigative interview is whether or not the case, facts, and evidence support the subject's story or contradict what the subject is stating. For example, if the subject states that he was not at the victim's home on the day of the murder, but video from the apartment building across the street shows him entering the subject's home on the day of the murder, the fact that he just lied to us about that outweighs any verbal, paralinguistic, or nonverbal behavioral response that might take place during the interview. In conclusion, if the rules outlined above are followed by the investigator during the interview process, then the evaluation of a subject's verbal and nonverbal behaviors can be a very helpful source of information regarding the subject's credibility. For additional information about the Reid technique, please review our investigator tips on Reid.com under the Resources button, and our YouTube channel, The Reid Technique Tips. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this presentation.